Welcome to the Intersecting Us podcast, where math and life intersect.
In today's podcast, Brian and Dave talk about discovering truth and the role of mathematics in understanding reality.
There's a great line that comes in the Bible, and it's said by a villain in the Bible. Actually, it's a guy by the name of Pontius Pilate. In the Latin version is quid est veritas, and in English it is what is truth. And that is a line that has permeated all kinds of cultures forever. How do you know what truth is? What is true? Last week, we talked about permanence and how mathematics helps us understand the foothold and the stability we get from permanence. But we also talked about the truth we get in mathematical proofs, that they don't change. And one of those proofs, Dave brought up at the end of our podcast last time. So, Dave, I thought maybe we'd have a chance, maybe you could talk a little bit more about one of those mathematical truths that is not going to change.
Right. Yeah. So last week I talked about the Pythagorean theorem that given a right triangle, AB with sides ABC, there's a little known fact in math that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But we don't have too many news flashes on our podcast, do we? I don't know.
No, we haven't yet, but you never know.
Well, I've got one today.
Okay.
News flash. The Pythagorean theorem is no longer true.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So everything we talked about last week, I guess I was wrong. And maybe we'll need to go in and correct it. But yeah, newsflash, Pythagorean theorem is not true, which means a squared plus b squared does not equal c squared. And I know that's a shock to all of us, but the reason why it is not true is another shocker, is that we do not live on a flat earth. Our earth that we live on is curved, it's round, it's spherical. And on a spherical surface, has been proven that a squared plus b squared does not equal c squared. And so what the math people have discovered is that if we are talking about Euclidean geometry, where essentially we are assuming that the surface is a flat plane, then yes, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But if we're talking about a curved surface like the Earth, then that is not true. And in fact, what math people have been able to prove is that, well, let me back up a second. The change that we have in math to go from a flat surface to a curved surface boils down to the fifth assumption, the fifth postulate that Euclid assumed. And he basically, it's called the parallel line postulate. And he talked about how parallel lines do not intersect, essentially is what he said. And so if you assume that is true, then yes, we do have the Pythagorean theorem. And what that implies is that we're on a flat surface. But if that assumption of the parallel assumption is not true, let's say if we say parallel lines do intersect, then that changes our triangles and they're no longer 180 degrees and we no longer have the Pythagorean theorem. And so what that teaches us is that there are different dimensions of truth. Both are still true, but they're true based on the assumptions that they're, founded on. And so I think that that's kind of like a good lesson for all of us to kind of digest how truth sometimes has different perspectives to it. And sometimes they surprise us. And we always have to keep a very open mind when we think we've got the last say on what is true.
Yeah. And again, it kind of comes back to what you said. There's kind of a presuppositions that you hope are also true that you're using, back kind of last week, the footholds and the permanence things that you can, if it's Euclidean geometry or the, other types. But I think one of the things that he had talked about, Francis Su had talked about in his book in other chapters, is the idea of exploring and trying to have the desire to know what is true. Mm-hmm. And I think even if it brings uncomfortable information. And that's kind of the idea that, do you want to know what is true, or do you want to know a particular kind of truth?
Right.
And I think that's what kind of comes into even our own lives now. Do we have presuppositions that say, well, these have to be stayed with, but yet we find out evidence maybe points that maybe one of those presuppositions is incorrect, but we won't, a lot of times we won't move that. And so we don't really come to quote the truth because we're not allowing ourselves to do it. And then I think that becomes, and he says, truth is a mark of human flourishing. But if you're not looking for it, I thought it was a really, I think it was his father that had cancer, Francis Sue in the book. And he used that as an analogy. And I thought that was a very good one. I'll take it a little farther, I guess, but it's really the idea if you go into, for his family or any family, you go into and your father has had some problems and you go in there with him. And do you want to know the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, or do you want to just hear what you want to hear,
Right.
And you don't want to hear, he had cancer, so you don't want to hear that. But if you don't know the truth, then you can't react in a real way. You're going to, it's the old adage. I've heard this before from people smarter than me, that you can be upset that there's only one medicine that helps diabetes, but it is the truth, and I think that's you say, well, I want ice cream. I want to eat more ice cream and that'll help diabetes. But we know it's not ice cream. We know it's insulin. And it might be it might be uncomfortable that you got to put one of those. I have friends, I don't know if you do, that have the little pumps now, and which is kind of like almost like an artificial pancreas, which is really cool, but it's still not pleasant. I mean, and they got to stick themselves and all that, but that's true.
Right.
And if you're going to say, well, I presuppose that it can't be something that hurts me, well, then you're not going to find the solution. And the same kind of back to your analogy, of the Pythagorean theorem, we can say, well, no, we're not going to we're staying with Euclidean. Well, you're not going to find the truth. Yeah.
Right. And this concept of truth is really one of the foundational things of why we're doing Intersecting Us. We actually have kind of three virtues that we've highlighted above all else, and it's beauty is one of them, and one of them is truth. And so we are excited about truth, but one of the reasons why I was motivated to really, do Intersecting Us is because what I've seen a lot of discussion about truth is kind of in this format where a person has identified what they think is true, and their job is to basically tell everyone else what that is. And there's elements that's not like wrong, but it's always rubbed me the wrong way that, we sometimes think that it's our job as humans to be pillars of light that we have the last say on truth, when in fact, I think the book does a great job of talking about truth, really involves depth of understanding and going deeper. And what I really like about what he put in the book was that truth is really a beautiful thing. And yes, there's times when truth is difficult, like learning about cancer. I mean, that there's nothing happy about that, but truth does set us free, and truth is beautiful. But unfortunately, I think there's been so many ways that we've kind of tried to communicate truth in our culture that has been, I guess, dismissive or condescending. And so, if that's been something you've experienced, and so when we talk about truth and it doesn't seem like this is going to be a fun topic for you, I really hope that you can be open to see the beauty of truth, because I know, Brian, that's one of the things that's motivated you to do what you do is you get excited about truth, and it's, it's not like we've got it all figured out at all. In fact, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And so there's this ongoing search for it. But, when you run across it, it's just kind of like really precious.
Yeah. And I do think the quest for it is a virtue, the quest for truth. I think the Blaise Pascal quote that he had, you have to, unless you love the truth, you can't know it. It's the idea that love being, something that you're really going to put effort into because you care about it. I think is what he's trying to tell us, Pascal there, because you get into, as you talk, he talked in the book and you were kind of talking about there too, when you get into relationships and later chapters are about power and freedom and justice and community and all those things, which is part of this. But he talked about how in our own culture right now, and I don't know how long ago he wrote the book. It wasn't too long ago, I don't think, a couple of years. But there's just a lot of distrust with different worldviews, I think the way he put it. And certainly each one of us can believe strongly that our worldview is true. But I think one of the biggest problems, and he used the analogy or the illustration of a totalitarian regime that just says, here's the truth, and that's the power part. I'm going to use this and you don't. There's no questioning about it. You're not really seeking truth. We've decided it. Know, and that doesn't. We've seen that doesn't work for human flourishing. But the idea that, and we've said this, philosophers do this a lot. For instance, we talked about this before. Perhaps you believe in a transcendent being that created everything. Okay. Well, you might not be 100% sure that that's true. But you may also say, I really believe it's more likely than not, given the evidence. It looks like that seems to be a much better chance of being true than not. But are you willing to step back and say, okay, I'm not 100% sure. You can put whatever percentage you want on it. Will I be willing to talk to somebody who doesn't believe that? And not just be condescending and say you're wrong and, totalitarian to them, but say, tell me why you see it differently. Because obviously we both can't be right. Somebody's wrong. But if I guess my big point is, if the truth that you hold, especially about transcendent things, cannot stand evidential scrutiny, then how really true is it?
Right.
And I think that's where we get into trouble. We had that in our own country for years. There was a certain view of different racial abilities and all that. And it's like, it took people to, well, first of all, just common sense, but it took people to talk to other people and see there's not a lot of differences between them. We may have different social backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and languages and all that stuff. But as far as the intrinsic worth of humanity, we're the same in that way. And we have that's true, but you have to step out of your, I guess, comfort zone to some extent, or sometimes just looking at things with blinders on and let the truth just come. But are you seeking it? It's a Socratic thing. Are we seeking truth? Or are we seeking our own most comfortable view of what truth can be?
Right. And at the heart of intersecting us, we really relish asking good questions, and for each other, for you, for ourselves, because we think that the questions are the beginning of like finding those truths. And so we're not about spitting out answers. I'm sure every once in a while we throw one out as a bonus that we've come up with, but it's not the main thrust of what we are out here doing is throwing out answers, but it's really challenging us with thinking deeper and encouraging you to think deeply for yourself. And so you can find so you can go on your journey for truth. Because one nice thing is that truth doesn't depend upon my ability to communicate it. And so it's not like whether or not I believe it or not, the truth is still going to remain true or false. And so as we try to be open and honest about our pursuit of truth, we don't have to guard it, realizing it does not need Brian and Dave to guard the truth.
No, and I do think when we look at truth, first of all, there are a few different definitions and ways of looking at truth, but the one I think makes the most sense philosophically and well, mathematically too, is that what's just called the correspondence view of truth. That truth lines up with what is real, with reality. And that's very much true in math and science, and I think life too. But But when you get to, again, it's how hard do I hold on to the truth? I think you hold on to whatever truth it is based on how much evidence you have. It's always, if you don't have evidential basis, why would you? And there's different types of truth. I mean, you could delineate these in a number of ways, but one philosophical way to do it is what we would call objective truth and subjective truth, and we'll be coming out with a few videos that I did. I think there's 8 of them on morality and ethics and objective and subjective truth and all that stuff. So that hopefully we can get in some conversations about that. But just to give you an example, the best ice cream in the world is butter pecan. That's a newsflash. That's another newsflash. I don't know if you knew that. Newsflash in one podcast.
Wow, we're going crazy.
Now, is that an objective truth or a subjective truth? Well, that's about taste, isn't it?
Right.
So I might think that, but somebody else may not. But it is true for me.
Right. Right.
And what has happened in our culture, I think, to some extent, and really there may be a lot of true reasons why, but I think it's maybe just because we don't critically think about things as good as we used to, and math can help you with that, is that we turn everything into a subjective truth.
Right.
And I think what math helps us do is it gives us some objective truths. You started off with the Pythagorean truth that in Euclidean geometry, that's objectively true. It doesn't make any difference if I like it or not.
Right.
And that's and kind of back to Francis Sue's book and some of his illustrations. If someone has cancer and they find a treatment that cures it, and then they go through the test and every test they can empirically and find out it's gone, wouldn't we say that's objectively true, that they no longer have cancer? And that's a good thing, right? I mean, so there's objective truths that way too. It's not, they aren't all transcendent, but I just encourage the listeners to think it's not really too hard. And the idea subject is the subject. That's me, the subject. It might be more than one person, but it's definitely just me. So the butter pecan thing, that's just my opinion, but it is true. But objective, it's outside of the particular subject's view. You could get 500 people who are ignorant about math who think it's true that in Euclidean geometry that the Pythagorean theorem is wrong because they just don't like it. They don't like triangles. Or whatever, they don't like math. They didn't like story problems when they were a kid. And so everything math they just disagree with. Well, that's very subjective, isn't it? And all we can do is ask their opinion. Well, that's not what we're doing in math. We're not asking our opinion. We're asking to try to find more of an objective truth, which I think is what Sue is talking about here, because he says the claim of truth is not the same as a deep understanding of truth.
Right.
And I think that's so cool. I mean, I know some about rocket science, but I don't understand it all. And so it's, I think it's objectively true, but you wouldn't want me to build a rocket. Not yet. Anyway, I need to do some more research, but yeah. So I think that's the idea. Even though we can see truth from multiple perspectives, math helps us think about truth in an objective way, which I think can cross over into philosophy, theology, worldviews, and say what is true. And there are objective truths in those things.
Well, I think that's great. And you've talked about those things in the past. And I know I've kind of been learning along with our listeners about some of this, I guess, wisdom you're expounding on. And the more I hear it, the more, it takes a while for all that to soak in. But I really think that those are good things to think about, kind of like those two different subjective and objective, two different ways of kind of thinking about different types of truth. I'm going to go kind of down a very light path because it's been a little heavy so far and talk about 4 ways.
We talked about ice cream. That's pretty light.
That's pretty light. Yeah. Except it's heavy on the calories, but 4 ways in math where math helps us with truth.
Okay.
And so the first one, you and I can go remember back in the days when we had record players. And one of the things you'd always be afraid of is you'd scratch it. And so if you scratch the record, then, it kind of ruined it. After that came CDs. And if you take a CD and take like a knife on it and scratch it like you would a record, you would think it would ruin all the information on there. And so we'll call the truth is what was on that CD before you scratched it. And what math can do is that it will correct that scratch. And it will basically be able to figure out there was data kind of lost when you scratched it, but math, there's algorithms in math that can piece that together, and essentially you wouldn't even know it was scratched. And so that is where kind of like math rescues the truth of the CD, even if we as humans go in and scratch it. So that's kind of like a pretty cool
That is pretty
fact.
neat. Yeah.
A pretty cool fact you heard here. Another one is credit cards. So you're giving your credit card number over the phone, and that 16-digit number is the fact. But we as humans, sometimes we screw up, reading digits, and, maybe we transpose two numbers, or we just turn a 6 into a 9, or who knows what. There's math algorithms that can quickly identify and say, hey, that number is not correct. And so they've got like error algorithms that identify common errors when we communicate credit card numbers that, are out there. When you go to Amazon or whatever, they're being used and we probably don't even know it. Again, it's protecting kind of like the truth of that credit card number. So there's fun fact number 2.
Number 2. There's 4, right?
There's 4. So number 3, okay, we're about ready to get a snowstorm here in Iowa. We can prove in math that at any point in time through the topic of topology, that there is a place on the planet Earth where there is no wind. And so I guess that's the truth, that at any moment in time, someplace is not experiencing wind, and topology and math can actually prove that. So
I'm sure they're not full of hot air.
I'm just the reporter here, speaking out the facts, but there's truth that, at one time we didn't know it, but we've discovered it thanks to math. And the final one I'll throw out of these fun facts is that if we try to solve the equation x squared equals -1, the truth of the matter is there's no solution until math decided to come up with, the number I, or the definition of I, which, is I squared equals -1. And that kind of gives us an idea that in math, we can invent our own truths. We can create new definitions that will become new assumptions. And once we set those things in place, well, then we have to kind of live with it, and we allow logic to do its thing. But we have the ability to almost like create our own universe and, kind of play God, so to speak, and define what are the underlying things that we're all assuming are true. And then logic kind of has its way with it. So those are just kind of fun little things where math is very interesting in its different ways of preserving truth or defining truth.
Well, and I think all of them have their merit. I like, the last one is kind of interesting because it made me think kind of like in literature, there's storytelling. You've got allegories, you've got fables, you've got illustrations, you've got parables. You might have like the tortoise and the hare, where we're not really talking about, we've created a world that's not truly real, but it gives truths, slow and steady wins the race, or whatever, those types of things. It's kind of like we got to get an eye in there, and then we can figure it out from there. You get into your kind of parallel universe like math does. And then, what happens, we've talked about this in former podcasts, you end up getting some things that cross over into reality. And that's what allegories do. One of my favorite allegorical stories, I guess, is The Lord of the Rings, which if you read what Tolkien's trying to do there's a big worldview behind all that. But none of that land is real. There's really not an Aragorn or a Frodo or a Sam or a Legolas. But yet, why do we read that? Or even back to the Marvel comics, we talked about those last week a little bit. Why is that intriguing to us? Well, it creates a different universe, a different world, like a place where, I equals the square root of -1. But but it also, there's something more there. It kind of makes us think about reality too, even though, and it makes our minds go farther maybe than just what we see around us. And there's transcendent truths that come there. One of the truths that seems to come out of almost every epic book or whatever is courage. You don't see that as the cowardice is never lifted up as a virtue in any of these things, because but we know that in reality. But when you read kind of a book of, if you read something like a Lord of the Rings and how Aragorn's doing what he's doing, I mean, it's the courage that makes the story keep going and makes it deeper and all those types of things. So I kind of like the way you put those out there. It's because you're still looking for some transcendent truths. And I think another thing that we're trying, along with helping people, whether it's in science, math, or life, to try to really have a quest for the truth. That was the quest, the quest for the truth. That when you do that, like we said before, you don't always find what you want, but the quest for the truth is more important than finding what we want. It's the idea of the virtue is we're trying to, I guess, if nothing else, prove to ourselves this is true. Prove to ourselves that courage is always a good thing. Prove to ourselves that life has meaning. Prove to ourselves that math is beautiful. We want to prove to other people, but as well as I do, if you get up on a whiteboard and you're going to do this long mathematical proof and you don't understand it and you're not sure that it's true, how much do you think the students are going to think it's true? So it is that quest to think for yourself. Get yourself convinced, and then you can convince others if that's something you want to do.
Yeah. And then Sue did a great job at taking it to the next level. One of the virtues that he gets out of that is the ability to admit you are wrong. And that is, I think, one of the beautiful things about truth that I hope that you meaning the listener, been able to kind of discover is that as we pursue truth, don't take ourselves too seriously. And there is actually joy in admitting that we make mistakes. And it's a virtue to be able to do that. And I'm like everybody else. There's times when it's difficult for me to, kind of swallow my pride and admit I made a mistake. But that's really not how I should be thinking about it. I should remind myself that there's virtue in admitting you're making mistakes. And in fact, the leading educators in math are identifying that our brain actually learns when we make mistakes. And so that's when our brain grows. So rather than looking at mistakes as something that is like shameful, we should look at it as a growing opportunity. And when we do that, it makes it a lot easier to admit you make mistakes. And if we are free to admit our mistakes, it sure makes it a lot easier to pursue truth because we're free to stumble along the way and struggle, which I guess is our topic next chapter, that there is struggle in going for truth. And we need to give ourselves grace in the process that we're not going to get it right the first time. And that's par for the course.
Well, and it's what I think he used the term intellectual humility,
exactly. Yes.
You're humble. Being humble is not saying I'm terrible. I mean, that might be true, but that's not being humble. It's realizing our shortcomings in being able to find truth. And he hinted at this, and I think it's really big in the life side of things. One of the biggest problems in any relationship can be that we assume something's true about someone that we find out if we really dug deep and got to know the person that it wasn't true, and I think that he used the word circumspection, where you kind of are prudent about it. You think about the fact that, okay, I don't know everything about this person. I might have presuppositions about their particular makeup, whatever it is, gender, ethnicity, age, location, whatever. But let's be humble and just try to find the truth about them. Because what's at stake, is our ability to get rid of harmful falsehoods. We want to be able to do that, and the ability to dialogue with people who have different worldviews, maybe, and different beliefs. Because you don't hold so tightly to a truth that you're not 100% sure, you're never going to find what Francis Schaeffer, one of my guys I like to read, theologians, true truth. You know, it's the idea that was just kind of another way of saying objective truth. It's like, you merely may be able to learn something. Doesn't mean you can't hold on to your own. I think if you believe your worldview is true, good. I hope you have good reasons for it. But are you willing to listen to others? What will happen if your worldview is true? When you talk to somebody who disagrees with it, and if you're able to back it up in a respectful way, you might even think, now it's more true than I even thought before. Because it's the scrutiny was there, and you might just help the other person see it in a different perspective. So,
to be willing to allow people to question our beliefs openly and not feel defensive about it, I think is cool. And another thing I really liked about what Sue put in there was that math helps us in our pursuit of truth to learn not to overgeneralize things, especially when it comes to people, that we can, put people in buckets. Like you said, that we can maybe make broad generalizations about a person, and then we get to know them and we find out, well, that really isn't true. And rarely are we simple enough people where, something is true or false about us. Is a person an angry person? Well, I get angry, but I'm not sure if, I would be considered an angry person. Maybe an angry person, but there's a lot of times where they're not angry. And so the point is that we often do things as humans. We put labels on people to try to make us complicated humans into black and white, yes or no answers, when in fact we are much more complicated than that. And we are a lot more alike than we are different, is what, kind of like one of the things that I believe. And so as we look at other people, we're really looking at a lot of ourselves in many respects.
Yeah, and I think as we finish up here, that kind of comes into the idea that if there is objective truth, and which we know there is in math and some science and in life and worldviews, then if we're all looking for that, we'll eventually come upon it. It might take some time, but the quest is part of the idea. But being humble enough to realize that maybe the way we look at the world and the way somebody else that looks at the world, there may be enough crossover to find some of objective truths that's always true, like courage and beauty and goodness and meaning and all those types of things. So we, as we sum up here, truth, again, it's what corresponds to reality. And as a lot of things we have in Intersecting Us, math does such a good job of helping us do that. It helps us take something that's fairly concrete and is repeatable and allows us to use that to see that they're true, and then can cross over into other parts of life to say that there's truths there that we can count on also. So this has been Intersecting Us. We thank you for coming. We're going to continue in future podcasts to get a few more chapters here in Francis Sue's book. Again, that's Mathematics for Human Flourishing, a very good book. We do encourage you to get that. Till next week, we'll sign off.
This has been the Intersecting Us podcast. To further engage with Intersecting Us, go to intersectingus.com.